Hello and welcome to the second lecture on the Establishment Clause, and we're going to be taking a look at the Establishment Clause controversies in this lecture. So what are we going to be doing in this lecture? Well, there are a lot of cases in the textbook on the Establishment Clause. And so the goal for this lecture is to just give you a broad overview of some of the major Establishment Clause controversies that have come to the Supreme Court so that you have a sense of just sort of like the big picture. But then in this lecture, we're also going to take a look at a couple of specific cases. However, I'm really depending on you to read the cases in the textbook in more detail. Again, this lecture just gives you a summary overview of what you'll be reading in the second half of Chapter 4. The first thing that we're going to look at is religion in public schools. And so we will look at the approach that the Supreme Court has taken to religious prayer in the public schools and also the teaching of religious curriculum in public schools. We're also going to take a look at religion in the public square. That is, any prayers that may take place at public meetings like town councils or meetings of the state legislature or the national legislature. And we're also going to look at what the courts have said about having religious displays in the public square, religious displays within City Hall or outside of City Hall. So we'll see what the court says about that. And then we'll end the lecture by looking at the government involvement in religious affairs. Remember, the Establishment Clause isn't just separating church and state, making sure that the state doesn't give funding to certain religions or where the state doesn't declare a national religion. The Establishment Clause is also telling the state that it can't get involved in the affairs of religious institutions. It can't be involved in the selecting of pastors, or it can't be involved in dictating, what the sermon is going to be that week or what the theological tenets are. And so we'll take a look at a case at the end of the lecture that explores this government involvement in religious affairs. So let's get started. So we know from the last lecture that government-required prayer in public schools is unconstitutional. It violates the Establishment Clause. We know that both from the case Engel v. Vitale from your textbook, and we talked about School District of Abington Township v. Schempt in our last lecture. So we know that that is unconstitutional. We also know from the last lecture that these were very unpopular decisions, that there's been a long tradition of having prayer in public school. So when the court came down with these decisions, there was a lot of backlash. People were very angry about the decision. But even though that's the case, you might think that given the public backlash, that the court might have changed its perspective and become less separationist when it comes to school in the public classroom, when it comes to prayer in public schools. But that was not the case. The court has been very consistent in finding prayer in schools, public schools, as unconstitutional. And so following these decisions in the 1960s, that there were efforts to maybe get around these rulings to institute, other types of prayers. So Wallace v. Jaffrey is a really good example of that. This is a case about an Alabama law that had a daily period of silence to start each class period. And it told students that they could use this daily period of silence to pray or to meditate or to just think about things. They could also not participate in it as well. But the court found very separationist. The court found that this law was unconstitutional. They said that there was no secular purpose associated with this law, and they really felt that this law was just a way of skirting the earlier decisions, and that it was a way to encourage prayer among students without explicitly coming out and saying it. So daily periods of silence, unconstitutional. Prayers at graduation, at middle school, high school graduations, unconstitutional. You'll read about Lee versus Weissman in the textbook, and the court says, nope, that's a public event. Everybody goes to it. You cannot have prayers at those kinds of events. And Santa Fe Independent School District v. Doe is about a case from Texas. And it's about this longstanding tradition that these school districts had to start prayers, or to start football games with student-led prayers. The students wrote the prayers, but that they recited them in front of everybody who attended the football game. And the Supreme Court said that that is unconstitutional, that this is basically a state-sanctioned support for a prayer at a public event, and that violates the Establishment Clause. So very strict separationists when it comes to prayer in school. Do keep in mind, though, that when it comes to your personal practice of prayer in school, you're allowed to do that. So as an individual, if you want to open up a Bible and recite a prayer before you take a test, if you want to join a student club, such as, there are student religious clubs on campuses that promote a particular religious perspective, that is constitutional. If students want to get together over the lunch hour and do prayer around the flagpole, all of that is constitutional. It's really what is unconstitutional is these state-sanctioned prayers at public school events. Okay, so we've learned about the prayer in public schools. What about the general teaching of religious principles in public schools? Well, in a private religious school, you can teach classes that promote specific religious beliefs, right? You can have classes that are dedicated to learning and promoting a particular theology. I mentioned before that I was raised Catholic, and that would be what we would call catechism. Well, that's the class that you would go to, get your religious training. Now, in public schools, you can learn about religion in a specific context, okay? You can definitely take a history of religion class. UWM teaches lots of philosophy of religion classes. I used to teach a religion and politics class. These are all appropriate classes to learn about religion in the sort of broad tradition of, what is a religion? How do you define it? What are, the differences, compare and contrast. You can do that in public school. But what you can't do in public school is that you cannot have a curriculum that promotes a particular religious doctrine or theology. The Supreme Court says that violates the Establishment Clause. Now, when it comes to teaching religious principles in public schools, some states have tried to insert religious doctrine into the teaching of secular subjects. And so having a straight up class that is dedicated to promoting a religious values and theology, that's clearly unconstitutional. Here's my cat not getting enough attention. Are you, sweetheart? That's clearly unconstitutional. But what if you try to insert religious doctrine into a secular subject? And a really good example of this effort to insert religious doctrine into a secular subject is the curriculum for biology classes, or particularly biology classes that look at the origins of life. So in a lot of biology classes, they explore the origins of plant and animal life. And in particular, we'll teach the scientific theory of evolution. The scientific theory of evolution is the idea that all species are related, and so they all come from a single tree of life, and that through the process of changing and mutating and evolving, that these species have gradually changed over time till we have the multitude of differences within the animals and plants and humans. You see those sorts of differences. It's a product of evolution. I'm not a biologist, so I'm just doing my best to sort of summarize the theory of evolution. Now, as many of us know, the theory of evolution, the idea that all species are related and that humans have evolved from, non-human species, such as, lower level primates, that the theory of evolution contradicts the biblical explanation of life. The biblical explanation of life is that humans descended from God, right? That man is made in God's image, and then, women break off the rib of Adam, and women are, I guess, secondarily related to the image of God, right? But bottom line is the biblical explanation is that humans descended from God. And that theory about the origins of life is known as creationism. And most recently, it's been rebranded as intelligent design because, as you know, in the textbook, the teaching of creationism has been ruled by the Supreme Court as being unconstitutional. unconstitutional. So I just wanted to make sure that we got that big picture about how religious doctrine can get inserted into a secular subject like biology and how those controversies develop before we look at a quick overview of the creationism cases that come to the Supreme Court. So during the course of the 20th century, some states have passed laws that mandate teaching creationism or intelligent design in science curriculum. In the early laws that you'll read about in the textbook coming from the 1920s criminalized the teaching of evolution. And so if you were a teacher and you taught evolution in the classroom, you committed a crime. But later laws, starting in the 1970s, because as we're going to see as we look at cases in a second, that after the 1960s, the late 1960s, the Supreme Court says that teaching creationism or criminalizing the teaching of evolution is unconstitutional. Then you see different approaches that states have taken. So later laws, 1970 into the present, into the 21st century, mandate the teaching of creationism alongside evolution. And all of these laws, both the criminalization of the teaching of evolution, the mandating of teaching only creationism, and the teaching side by side of creationism and evolution, or side-by-side intelligent design and evolution, all of those laws have been deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. You can read in your textbook about the famous Scopes monkey trial. That's a famous case that looks at a Tennessee law that makes it a crime to teach evolution. It got a lot of attention in your high school. You might have, if you ever did the play Inherit the Wind, you might be familiar with the Scopes monkey trial. But that was sort of the first case. It didn't go to the Supreme Court, but it was one of the first trials that draws attention to these laws that forbid and criminalize the teaching of evolution. Apperson versus Arkansas from 1968. This is a Supreme Court case that is, sort of revolves around the same question that was on trial within the Scopes trial. In this case, this is a case that comes from Arkansas. Obviously, Arkansas had a state law on its books since 1928 that made it a crime for a university or public instructor to teach the theory or doctrine that mankind ascended or descended from a lower order of animals. In other words, a crime to teach evolution. And the Supreme Court, ruled that law unconstitutional because the theory of creationism, the theory of the origins of life coming from human life originating from God, that is a religious doctrine, and that violates the Establishment Clause. Following after the Apperson versus Arkansas case, where it's clear that the straight up forbidding of teaching of evolution is unconstitutional, there were efforts to sort of get the side-by-side treatment. And that's what happens in Edwards v. Aguilar. That this is a case that takes a look at Louisiana laws. And the Louisiana state legislature passes a law that's called the Balanced Treatment for Creation Science and Evolution Science and Public School Instruction Act from 1981. It basically, says that that if you're going to teach evolution, you have to teach creationism side by side. And the Supreme Court ruled that unconstitutional as well. And then finally, while this case, Kitzmiller v. Dover Area School District from 2005, this case never went to the Supreme Court. It was adjudicated in the lower federal courts, and the Supreme Court never granted the appeal of writ of certiorari. They let this lower decision stand. But this is a case about the teaching of intelligent design in schools. There was a Dover School District in Pennsylvania had a law that taught intelligent design as a legitimate scientific theory, and the federal court said no, that it's intelligent design is just a rebranding of creationism, and it too is unconstitutional because it violates the Establishment Clause. Okay, so we know that state-sponsored prayer and teaching religious curriculum in public schools is unconstitutional. But what about what about prayers that take place in other public venues? That prayers to start a session of the United States Congress, sessions of the state legislatures, a town hall meeting. Do those kinds of prayers in the public venue violate the Establishment Clause? Well, that question comes to the court in the case Marsh v. Chambers in 1983. And this is a case about the state of Nebraska, and that the state of Nebraska, they start each of their legislative sessions with a prayer. And it's a state-sponsored chaplain. And so they hire a chaplain who's paid by public tax dollars, and then they serve for a 2-year term, and during the course of their term, when called upon, they give prayers before sessions of Congress. And you know that some found that this was clearly violating the Establishment Clause. They said that, look, my taxpayer dollars are being paid for a chaplain to provide a religious prayer before a session of Congress or state legislature that clearly violates the Establishment Clause. And one would think that it would violate the Establishment Clause, given the ruling that the Supreme Court have made when it comes to prayer in public schools. But the Supreme Court did not find this law in Nebraska to be unconstitutional. In a 6-3 vote, they ruled that this practice is, in fact, constitutional. Why? Why did they think it was constitutional? Well, they don't use the Lemon test. So even though the Lemon test was created at this time, they don't use that to determine whether or not this law violates the Establishment Clause. Instead, and that's one of the frustrations with the Establishment Clause, we have a test, but we don't employ it. And quite frankly, if the test had been employed, it's likely that this law in Nebraska would have been deemed unconstitutional. Instead, they looked to the intent of the founders and had sort of an originalist viewpoint on this. They said that the tradition of praying before legislative sessions has a long history in the United States, and it's basically a part of the fabric of society. While prayers didn't start the Constitutional Convention, that was a deliberate choice that the delegates at the Constitutional Convention made. The first Congress of the United States, and from that point forward, has been started with prayer. So they basically said that if the framers wrote the Establishment Clause, but at the same time they allowed the practice of having chaplains recite religious prayers at Congress, that clearly the Establishment Clause does not bar this kind of practice. And so they ruled that it was in fact constitutional. A legislative session. You could say that a legislative session is a very specific context, that it's generally not open to a public, or if it is, the purpose of a legislative session isn't for the public. It's mostly for the representatives, ruling on, making decisions on the behalf of the public. And so you could argue that these prayers are really directed not broadly to the public, but directed to those lawmakers, helping them find some solemnity as they're going forward with their task, and a prayer brings that. But what about a town council meeting? Like if you just, in Waukesha, you go down to the city hall, they have monthly meetings, in, Milwaukee, monthly meetings. What about opening a local town council meeting with a prayer? Does that violate the Establishment Clause? Well, let's see what the court says. The question about prayers at a town council meeting comes to the court in the case Town of Greece versus Galloway. It's a 2014 case. And in the picture there, I always like to select a picture that it is the day that the decision came down, that the Reverend Schneck of the Faith in Action is basically speaking in front of the Supreme Court, heralding the decision of the court. Spoiler alert, the court found that a prayer before the town council is, in fact, constitutional, doesn't violate the Establishment Clause. So let's look at the facts of the case, and then we'll take a look at how the court reasoned. So this is about a case that comes out of the town of Greece, and that's a a city that is near Rochester, New York, so sort of like an upstate New York. And starting in 1999, they allowed local clergy to come and recite a prayer at the beginning of their monthly meetings. So they had monthly meetings, and then they basically, allowed local clergy to come in and give a prayer. And the purpose of this, why they allowed this, is because they wanted to invoke divine guidance. They wanted to bring solemnity to the event. And so they thought it was an appropriate activity to engage in. Now, to select the prayer givers, the town employees contacted local congregations asking for volunteers to give these prayers, these invocations. Anybody was eligible, any congregation, any person, anyone who could come and do that. The town employees did contact congregations, but the idea was that anybody who wanted to give a prayer could, and that would include atheists if they wanted to come. The clergy crafted the prayer. The city council did not craft the prayer. They gave the people no guidance in what to say. It was up to the clergy member to determine what the prayer was. It wasn't reviewed by the city, and anybody could participate. Susan Galloway is the plaintiff in the case. That her and her friend, Linda Stevens, they attended a council meeting because there was an issue that they were concerned about and they wanted to talk about. They knew it was on the agenda for the meeting. And so they attended the local meeting, and they were really shocked at the nature of the prayer. They said that the prayer itself had pervasively Christian themes. It wasn't non-denominational. Galloway was Jewish. Stevens is atheist. And, they really felt that these prayers were promoting a particular kind of religion. And they found that, having to sit and listen to that, they felt like it was a violation of their rights. They shouldn't have been subjected to that. They found that it was offensive, and that they also felt that it was promoting a particular viewpoint that was sending a message about that maybe the town council wasn't support of a diverse community that was filled with lots of people, not just Christian people. Now they complained to the town council, and the town council reached out to other members of the faith community to sort of diversify it. But that being said, Galloway still felt that she was harmed by this, that she didn't feel like she needed to sit through that in order to participate in the town council meeting. She felt that listening to that was coercive. And so then she sues the town of Greece for violating the Establishment Clause. The town of Greece said, look, Marsh is the precedent here, that there's this long tradition of having prayers before legislative sessions. Why would this be any different? And in fact, the town isn't supporting or diminishing any religion because it's open to any congregation or religious folks can come and give this speech. But Galloway's lawyers countered, and they said, look, that this is not a prayer for lawmakers. This is a prayer at a common council meeting, at a city council meeting. And that's open to the public, and public get involved. If you've ever watched or gone to a city council meeting, people show up, they stand at the podium, they talk directly to the lawmakers, and that doesn't happen in a legislative session. And that they felt like making people who wanted to participate in the town council sit through the prayer, they felt that was coercive. They also felt that even though anybody could come, that the prayers themselves were very, very sectarian. They weren't non-denominational. And that kind of pushes it over the line of really being sort of promoting a particular religious, the city promoting a particular religious perspective. So let's see how the court rules on this. All right, so the question before the court in this case is, does the prayer at the common council meeting, does the prayer policy that they have, does it violate the Establishment Clause? And in a 5-4 decision, very close, they said no, that the majority of the court said that the policy that is used by the town of Greece to allow for these prayers before common council, it does not violate the Establishment Clause. What is the reasoning here? Well, the reasoning is that, again, the Levin test is not used, but that Marsh is used as a precedent, that Roberts argues that there's a long history of this practice and that Marsh is the precedent in this case. And so they're going to apply Marsh. That's the case about the new Nebraska state legislature to this. They also said that there was not just that, but there were other features of this policy that made it so that the city was not, basically violating the Establishment Clause. That the city was really hands off in the prayer. They didn't review the prayer. They didn't write the prayer. They basically just opened the door to allowing prayer. And in fact, they said that if the city got involved to make sure that it was diverse and ensured that the prayer was non-sectarian, non-denominational, then that in itself would maybe be a violation of the Establishment Clause because the city was getting too involved in the business of the government. They also said that local board meetings are not mandatory, so there's really no coercion there. You don't have to go to a town hall meeting, so you don't have to listen to the prayer. Although that, I'm not sure I agree with that perspective, that last point, because, it's sort of like, well, then, then you can't have your voice heard at that local council meeting. They also said that the audience is the lawmakers, not the public. And so the intent of the policy was to communicate solemnity to the lawmakers, not to the public. The four justices dissent on this. And so had there been another justice the other way, it would have gone the other way. So again, can sometimes be the frustrating aspect of the Supreme Court, that there's not more of a unanimous take on our interpretation of the Establishment Clause. Justice Kagan writes the dissent. She says that the town hall is significantly different than the legislative session. I had mentioned that on the last slide, that it's more participatory and there's much more of a role that the public plays in town hall meetings. She was really felt that even though the policy was not allowed for an open door for anybody to come in, the practice was very sectarian and the prayers were really sectarian. And she felt that in itself violated the Establishment Clause. She says that the town council meeting doesn't have to be a completely religious free zone, but it does need to be non-sectarian and it does need to be a diverse. And if it's not that, then it violates the Establishment Clause. So you can think about where you stand on this issue, because, kind of strong arguments are made on both sides. So following the decision in the town of Greece, saying that prayers before a common council meeting are constitutional, well, people, stepped up to the plate and test out the theory of the constitutionality. This is an instance where at a Pensacola City Council meeting in Florida, that had a policy very similar to the policy of the town of Greece, where common council meetings were started with a prayer and that was open to whoever wanted to give a prayer. Well, there you have it. Put on my magic pencil here. The Church of Satan comes and they want to start the common council meeting with a prayer that in celebration of Satan. Well, the people of the city of Pensacola, they weren't too happy about that. So there was a big protest, so that while this individual stood up to give the satanic invocation, everybody else was, strongly reciting the Lord's Prayer and condemning his religious perspective, saying that it was wrong and it was evil and that he shouldn't be allowed to do it, but that, only certain kinds of prayers should open the meeting. So you can sort of see that this is a demonstration of why there might be some sense in having a strict wall of separation between church and state, because it doesn't take very much to sort of introduce conflict and, ill will when there is this commingling of church and state, as is seen in the city of Pensacola. So just maybe think critically about this, the prayer in public venues. And so we know that the court erects a strong and tall wall between church and state in public schools, but not in other public venues. And even though we're not going over it in class, in your textbook, they talk about displays in front of city councils or in front of city halls and public parks, religious displays. And the court has been, very accommodationist when it comes to those sorts of presentations of religion within the public venue. So why is there this strong wall in public schools and not in these other public venues from the court's perspective? I think what the court's thinking is that children are impressionable, and so that that public school, children, when they hear a prayer at school or they hear a teacher that's reciting a prayer, they're more impressionable. Their values aren't fully shaped yet, and so school can play a big role in shaping those values. And It's probably not appropriate for schools to do that, but those values should come from the family. But by the time you're an adult, your viewpoints are, kind of shaped, and your religious views probably aren't going to be changed just by hearing a prayer at a legislative session or seeing a religious display at the outside of the city hall. There's also a power dynamics. The role of a school administrator, of a teacher, of a principal, reading these prayers over the loudspeaker, that's a power dynamic. And that also, even though they say that school children can stand out in the hall if they don't want to listen to these prayers. Well, you've got to kind of have a lot of courage to do that. And younger kids in particular may not have that courage. And also you don't want to seem like the oddball out, the one who doesn't want to participate. That's not likely to happen in these other venues where they're populated with adults. And it's also this idea that, the role of the parents, it's the role of the parents, not the state, to instruct or to not instruct children in religion. And so I think that's why the court has taken a much stronger separationist stance when it comes to religion in public schools. Okay, so up to this point, we have been looking at cases that revolve around aiding or accommodating religion. The next case we're going to look at is government getting involved in the internal organization and the internal affairs of religious institutions. And asking the question, does the government have the authority to tell churches how to conduct their internal business? Or when they do that, is that a violation of the Establishment Clause? Now, keep in mind, your textbook talks about how churches today are much bigger and more public than they have been in the past. Churches have big mega churches. They use the airwaves and the television to broadcast their ministry. They are involved in, having healthcare facilities, schools, nursing homes, etc. And so keep in mind that when it comes to those kinds of public activities, they are subject to state regulations, okay? Even though they might be religious institutions, you have to still make sure that the water is drinkable and that people who are in the health care facility are, being treated appropriately and following all the Medicare and Medicaid guidelines, etc. But what about the, not the public activities of the church, but what about the internal or private activities of the church? In particular, can government regulate who the church hires or fires? Because as we know, there are a host of anti-discrimination laws that we have in the United States. You can't fire somebody because of their race or their sex or because of their physical abilities. Those are all protected from the actions of an employer. And so, but what about religious institutions? Are religious institutions subject to those sorts of anti-discrimination laws? And the next case explores that issue. Okay, so the case that deals with the government getting involved in the internal affairs of religious institutions is Hosanna Tabor Evangelical Lutheran Church and Schools versus the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And the picture there are two lawyers who are representing religious interest groups and that they are wanting to defend the rights of this church, and they are talking to the press after oral arguments in this case. So what is this case about? Well, this case is about a religious school. And this religious school is a part of the Missouri Synod of the Lutheran Church. And like any religious school, it offers a Christ-centered education for K through 8 students. Now, there are two types of teachers that work at this school, and this is key to this case. Some of the teachers are called lay teachers, and other teachers are called teachers. In other words, the lay teachers are they're just like regular teachers. They teach secular subjects. But the called teachers, they get specific training. and that they are basically trained to become ministers of religion within the school. Okay, so you've got lay teachers, and called teachers. This is about an individual who worked at the school. Her name is Cheryl Parrish, and she started as a lay teacher at the school in 1999, but then she becomes a called teacher. She was trained to become a minister of religion for the school in 2000. Now, in 2004, she gets sick. And she takes leave due to the medical condition. She develops narcolepsy, where she falls asleep. And so she takes leave, and then when she's better and she gets the treatment that she needs, she tells the school that she's ready to come back to school. And the church disagrees. They don't want her to come back. They want her to resign. And that in exchange for her resigning, they say that they will pay her healthcare expenses. Okay. But Cheryl doesn't want to resign. She wants to come back, and she refuses to resign. And she says if they fire her, that she's going to sue them. And so they go ahead and fire her, and she issues suit. And so, she argues, she's fired, and then she files a claim with the EEOC saying that her rights to be treated free from discrimination have been violated. There's a provision, federal law called the Americans with Disability Act, and that people cannot be fired if they have a disability. And she had this disability, but she got medical treatment for it, and she's ready to come back to school. And she feels like the ADA had been violated. And so what the school says is that this is not the case, that the Establishment Clause prevents the government from appointing ministers. And Cheryl Parrish is a minister teacher. She is a called teacher. She's a minister of religion, and they get to decide who they want their ministers to be. And if the state gets involved in telling the church who their ministers are, that you have to continue to employ Cheryl Parrish, they're basically getting way too involved in the internal activities of the church. And they also said that granting Parrish's claim that she has been discriminated against and that she needs her job back, that it would too closely entangle church and state, thus violating one of the three prongs of the Lemon Test. The EEOC takes a different approach. They basically say that the government really has a compelling interest to make sure that people aren't discriminated in the workplace. She has a disability, but it's not one that prevents her from doing her job, and that she should not be fired. She should be protected by the Americans with Disability Act. And that furthermore, saying, well, we'll resign and we'll pay for your health care. And then she says, well, no, that's not fair. I'm going to sue you. And then she gets fired. Well, that is coercion. That's sort of basically, retaliating against an employer for saying that they're violating the ADA Act. And so those are the arguments on both sides of the case. Let's see how the court ruled in this case. Okay, so the question before the court in this case is, does the Establishment Clause bar employees wrongfully terminated from suing their employers for reinstatement and damages when the employer is a religious group and the employee is one of the group's ministers? And in a unanimous decision, the court says yes, and Justice Roberts wrote the majority opinion. They say that Ms. Parrish is a minister according to the church, and both the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause prohibit the government from interfering with the hiring and firing of ministers. In other words, the church or the religious institution makes its own decisions about who it wants to have as ministers within their church. The government can't get involved in it. And that is what's known as the ministerial exception. All right, that's it for the Establishment Clause. Thanks a lot for paying attention. And next week we start freedom of expression. Talk to you again soon.